John was relieved to see them and welcomed their presence. Jim had heard about John's fight with Rickards from Belding and praised him for it. Miller, on the other hand, couldn't stop talking about Belding's horses. It was obvious that horses were his passion. "I've had women leave me, but never a horse," he exclaimed. "Belding is going to lose some of those horses for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there was more trouble on the border than along the Rio Grande. We're practically on greaser soil. We may not be as likely to get shot up as we would be across the line, but we're not exactly safe either." "But who's going to give up their horses without a fight?" asked Laddie. "Half the time when Belden's stock is out of the alfalfa, it's grazing over the line. He thinks he's careful about those horses, but he ain't." "Look here, Laddie, you can't believe all you hear," replied Jim seriously. "I reckon we might not have any trouble." "Back up, Jim. Surely you're standing on your bridle. I don't go much on reports. Remember that American we met in Casita, the prospector who had just gotten out of Sonora? He had some story, he had. Swore he'd killed 17 greasers breaking through the rebel line around the mine where he and other Americans were corralled. The next day when I met him again he was drunk, and then he told me he'd shot 30 greasers. The chances are he did kill some. But reports are exaggerated. There are miners fighting for their lives down in Sonora, you can bet on that. And the truth is bad enough. Take Rickards's harrying of the senorita, for instance. Can you beat that? Sure, Jim, there's more going on than just raiding a few horses, and Forlorn River is going to get hers. Another dawn found Gorman feeling much better, and he got up and looked after himself, not, however, without considerable difficulty and rather disheartening twinges of pain. Sometime during the morning he heard the girls in the patio and called to ask if he might join them. He received one response, a mellow, "Yes, sir." It was not as much as he wanted, but considering that it was enough, he went out. He had not yet visited the patio, and surprise and delight awaited him. He found himself lost in a labyrinth of green and rose-bordered walks. He strolled around, discovering that the patio was a courtyard open at one end, but he failed to discover the young ladies, so he called again. The answer came from the center of the square. After ducking under shrubs and trudging through bushes, he finally made his way to an open sandy clearing, brimming with impressive yet dangerous cacti that he had never seen before. Across from him, beneath the shade of a stunning tree, were the two girls, Selina lounging in a hammock and Mona resting on a blanket. "Wow, what a beautiful tree," he exclaimed in awe of its uniqueness. "What kind is it?" "Palo Verde," Mona replied. "Senor, that means green tree," Selina chimed in. This desert tree may have been small, barely extending beyond the roof, but it was captivating due to its exquisite green color, from trunk to minuscule flat twigs, and the fact that it appeared to be completely leafless. It lacked thorns entirely. This was the beginning of John's desert education, even if he didn't have such delightful teachers. The patio was packed with wonders of the desert. Mona pointed out a twisty-trunked tree with gray leaves, which she called a mesquite. John now realized where the pale gray color of the desert came from. A colossal, towering, fluted green column was identified by Mona and Selina as a saguaro, or giant cactus. Ocotillo, a cactus that looked like the legs of an upside-down devilfish and had symmetrical branches with sharp blades that appeared to be both leaves and thorns, piqued his interest. Another cactus, the bisnaga or barrel cactus, captured Gorman's attention. It looked like a mammoth low barrel covered in green-ribbed cloth and long thorns. The girls explained that this plant was a happy exception to its neighbors in the desert, as it concealed water that had saved the lives of many men. The final cactus that caught Gorman's attention was a small plant with a stem and many rounded bumps, all a frosty silver-white color and covered in long, deadly spikes. It was known as cholla and added a frosty shimmer to the desert landscape. John's eagerness to learn was infectious, and he impressed his teachers with his dedication, though he struggled with learning Spanish. Despite this, he managed to learn a few basic phrases like buenos dias and gracias. Gorman was thrilled to have the opportunity to learn from a beautiful Spaniard and a sweet American girl who was beginning to shed her shyness. As they spent more time together, Gorman hoped to see Mona's daring side, but he only caught glimpses of it. He longed to see the vivacious personality that had been described to him by others, but it never quite materialized. Nonetheless, he remained hopeful and eager to learn more about the desert, Spanish, and the mysterious Mona Edwards. John had found himself alone with Mona in the patio on a few occasions, but each time she had grown distant and left on some flimsy excuse. The last time it had happened, Selina had returned to find John staring forlornly at the path where Mona had disappeared. Selina was perceptive, and she could tell that something was bothering him. She reached out and touched his hand, offering her silent support. As they talked, John began to confide in Selina about his feelings for Mona. He was drawn to her, but he didn't understand why she kept pushing him away. Selina listened sympathetically, offering her own insights about Mona's life. She had grown up moving from place to place, never staying in one town or school for very long. Mona's mother was constantly searching for her own father, who had disappeared in the Sonora Desert years ago. They had lived in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas before settling in Forlorn River. Mona loved the desert, but she longed to see other places too. She remembered Lawrence, Kansas, where she had gone to school for a few years and had seen college races and football games. John was fascinated by Mona's stories, and he began to understand why she was so guarded. He wanted to be the one to show her the world, to help her find what she was looking for. With Selina's encouragement, he set out to win Mona's heart and show her that there was more to life than the desert. I've always been intrigued by big football games, reading about them in magazines and newspapers. One day, Mr. Gorman asked me if I've ever seen a game. I replied that I've seen a few and laughed a little, holding back from bragging about my own experiences. However, I was able to vividly describe the color, sound, and excitement of the games to Selina and Mona, who were hanging on to my every word. As I spoke, I noticed Mrs. Belding's presence and remembered hearing her call earlier, but Selina and Mona were completely absorbed in my story. Mrs. Belding cast a strange look at Mona before silently leaving through the patio. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Despite the shaky start, I continued my tale, but the strange expression on Mrs. Belding's face, with a look of repressed pain and hopelessness, stayed with me. I wondered if she had seen how deeply I had fallen in love with Mona, and maybe even more than I had dared to hope. The incident left me perplexed and distressed. I wanted to tell Mrs. Belding how I felt about Mona, but the fear of destroying my hopes held me back. So I decided to wait. Despite his desire to protect himself, John felt compelled to share his thoughts and feelings with Mona. He struggled to find the right words to express who he was and how much he loved her, as well as his plans for the future. However, he hesitated and remained quiet, feeling melancholy and thoughtful. Seeking solace in the outdoors, John was struck by the dazzling white light of the sun, which seemed to dominate the arid region. The hot, dry breeze carried the scent of untainted places and strange plants, which made him feel alive and energized. When John returned to the house, he found that his room had been tidied up, and a fresh red rose lay in the middle of his table. It was a delicate bud, just beginning to open and reveal its deep red heart. John was moved by its beauty and fragrance, wondering if Mona had left it there intentionally. Was it a symbol of hope, a message of love, or simply an act of kindness? He could not be sure, but the rose filled him with a sense of longing and desire. Chapter 9. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on a dreary December day, a rider made his way along a worn and barely visible path about 50 miles west of Forlorn River. Every so often he pulled up and paused to survey the terrain that lay before him. The vast and desolate desert was barren, with nothing but dull-colored greasewood and small prickly pear plants dotting the landscape. Mountains surrounded the valley, their black peaks rising above the lomas and mesas. A solitary rider sat atop a magnificent white horse, whose coat was caked with sweat and dust. The horse's mane and tail were tied up to avoid getting caught on the rough terrain. The horse's front legs were shielded with homemade leather coverings, protecting them from the harsh environment. Despite the horse's many scars and lumps, it was a strong and fierce animal, bred to survive in the unforgiving desert. The rider was a young man with a powerful build, his face sunburned and peeling. His dark eyes held a sharp, penetrating gaze, and his jaw was set like that of a mastiff. Though he exuded a certain ruthlessness, there was still a hint of youthfulness in his features. This was John Gorman, a man who had undergone a profound transformation since arriving in the small town of Casita. Love, chivalry, and friendship had awakened deep emotions within him, leading him to embrace the challenges of the desert and all its hardships. He had spent years in this harsh environment, experiencing heat, thirst, hunger, and loneliness, but he had emerged stronger and fiercer than before. The blazing sun beat down on him, its intense heat blurring the landscape around him. His chapped lips split and his tongue felt like sandpaper against his dry mouth. A gnawing pain in his stomach made him feel sick and weak. He was surrounded by an overwhelming silence, an emptiness that left him feeling utterly alone and abandoned. He had ridden for hours, his horse plodding through the sand, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of water. He had spent a sleepless night alone, keeping watch for any danger that might come his way. The fear of ambush was always present, and he was always ready to flee at a moment's notice. He had experienced the thrill of the chase, pursuing wild men who were as quick as Bedouins on their magnificent mounts. He was willing to take a life if necessary, and he had felt the pain of thorns and bullets tearing through his flesh. The desert was a place of extremes, where the burning sun gave way to a bone-chilling cold at night. The icy wind cut through him like a knife, and the morning dew left him shivering and numb. His adventure had begun with Miller and Lash, two hard-riding rangers who had shown him the ropes. But he had traveled alone for 100 miles, from Forlorn River to the Sonoita Oasis. Miller's warning of trouble on the border had proved to be an understatement. Rebels had taken over the garrison at Casita, and outlaws and bandits roamed the countryside. They were like Arab troops, raiding and pillaging at will. The rangers' job was no longer just to patrol the border and stop smugglers. They had to protect Belding's horses, which were the fastest around and had been stolen by the raiders. The rangers faced constant danger, not just from the raiders, but from the Mexican authorities as well. Belding stayed close to home to protect his family and his property, but the rangers had to venture out into the wilds to do their job. They had been robbed, pursued, and injured, but they kept going, determined to do what was right. There were a few waterholes that needed to be reached, which lay deep within Mexican territory. It was a dangerous task, but Miller and Lash were not the kind of men who would shy away from a challenge. They had lived peaceful lives for a long time, but their slow-to-anger nature had eventually given way to a fierce determination. Desert vultures could tell of the gruesome story that followed. John Gorman had become an ally of these bordermen, and he too had thrown himself into the desert action and strife with a rare physical ability and an intense heart. It was a remarkable fact that he had not yet fallen by the wayside. On this December afternoon, the three rangers were separated, as often happened. Lash was far to the west, along the Camino del Diablo, a terrible devil's road where many travelers had perished. Miller was supposed to meet Gorman near the Papago well, but he was long overdue. The fact that Miller had not shown up was significant. The sun had hidden behind clouds all day, an unusual occurrence for that region, even in winter. As the light began to fade, announcing the hidden sunset, a cold, dry wind blew in Gorman's face. At first it was barely noticeable, but it gradually chilled him to the bone. He took his coat from the back of his saddle and put it on. A few cold drops of rain touched his cheek. He stopped at the edge of a low escarpment and looked down at the narrowing valley below. The landscape was barren, dotted with mesquite and cactus. Moving objects caught his eye, gray and white in color and diminutive in size. They bobbed away for a while, then stopped. They were antelope, and they had seen his horse. When he rode on, they started again, keeping to the lowest level. These vigilant creatures were often the guardians of the ranger in the desert. They would expose the presence of any horse or man. With them leading the way, he was able to make better time for a few miles across the valley. When he lost sight of them, he proceeded with caution once again. The valley gradually rose and narrowed, finally leading to an arroyo where the grass began to show gray between the clumps of mesquite. Shadows emerged ahead in the hollows, along the walls of the arroyo beneath the trees, and they appeared to creep, to rise, to float into a veil cast by the background of striking mountains, and finally to claim the skyline. Night was not imminent, but it was there in the east, rising upward, falling downward, encroaching upon the west. Gorman dismounted from his horse to lead it forward at a slower pace. He had ridden 60 miles since morning, and he was exhausted. A wound in his hip that had not entirely healed caused one of his legs to drag a little. The Papago well, 1 mile up the arroyo near its head, was his next destination. He needed water for his horse, but getting it entailed a risk that he would otherwise have avoided. The well was on Mexican soil. Gorman saw a faint light flickering through the thin, sharp foliage. There were campers at the well, and whoever they were, they had probably prevented Miller from meeting Gorman. Miller had returned to the next waterhole, or he might have been hiding in an arroyo to the east, waiting for further developments. Gorman turned his horse around, not without using some force and persuasive language, for the desert horse smelled the water and wanted to drink. He headed back to the edge of the arroyo, where he halted in a secluded circle of mesquite. The horse snorted its relief at the removal of the heavy, burdened saddle and equipment, and sagging, bent its knees, lowered itself with a slow heave, and plunged down to roll in the sand. Gorman emptied the contents of his larger canteen into his hat and held it to the horse's nose. "Drink, Saul," he said. Blanco Saul nuzzled Gorman's hand, grateful for the small drop of water he provided. Gorman loved the horse, and they had been through many hardships together, spending countless days and nights in the quiet desert. Saul had been owned by others before, but none as kind as Gorman. Gorman was a novice when it came to horses, but he was a quick learner. They found a patch of galeta grass for Saul to graze on, and Gorman fashioned a makeshift halter from his lariat to keep him from wandering too far in search of water. Removing his chaparejos, Gorman grabbed his rifle and disappeared into the shadows. The coyotes howled in the distance, and Gorman was on high alert. He moved slowly, careful not to make a sound as he stepped through the soft sand. The flickering light of a campfire was visible in the distance, but the coyotes' howling did not put Gorman at ease. He needed to find out who the campers were and if they had water for Saul. As he crept closer, every rustle and patter made him pause and listen. The night was pitch black, with no stars in sight. The mesquite trees created a maze of pale, zigzagging aisles that Gorman navigated carefully. He was not seeking trouble, but he needed to find water for his loyal companion. As he made his way through the desert, Gorman lost sight of the light for a while. However, the howling of coyotes made it evident that he was getting closer to the campfire. Eventually, he saw the light flickering through the black branches, which grew into a flame. With the bushy mesquites blocking his view of the fire, Gorman bent down low and moved forward. The coyotes continued their chorus, and the sound of hooves trampling and stamping worried him. He advanced cautiously, crawling on his belly when he felt it was necessary. The wind was in his favor, and it prevented the coyotes and horses from detecting his scent. As he approached the well at the head of the arroyo, the vegetation grew thicker. Finally, he found a good spot near a dead palo verde tree with black clumps of mistletoe thick in the branches. Cautiously, he crawled around until he found a comfortable position to peep from behind his cover. He saw a bright fire, not the kind used for cooking, but a crackling blaze of mesquite. 3 men were visible, all close to the burning sticks. They were coarse-looking Mexicans, the type of raiders, rebels, and bandits that Gorman had expected to find. One of them stood up with his back to the fire, while another sat enveloped in a blanket. The third man lounged in the sand, almost touching the flames with his feet. All of them had cast off their belts and weapons. Gorman noticed 3 short, shiny carbines leaning against a rock. A glint of steel caught his eye. To the left of the circle of light stood a square adobe house, supported by untrimmed poles. The roof was made of brush, which was partially collapsed. It was a Papago Indian dwelling that had been occupied by a family until a roving band of outlaws had murdered or driven them away a month before. In the distance, a corral could be seen through the flickering light of a campfire. The sounds of horses, snorting, stamping, and whinnying echoed through the night. Gorman observed the scene in a quick glance, then settled himself at the base of a mesquite tree. He had hoped to see more men, but the situation was all too familiar. This was one of the many raider bands that plagued the borderlands. They were notorious for stealing horses or driving away herds that had already been stolen. These bands were more numerous than the waterholes in northern Sonora. They never stayed in one place for long and roamed over the desert like nomads, ranging from Nogales to Casita. If Gorman had approached the campfire peacefully, there was a good chance the raiders would kill and rob him. The odds were against him, even if they recognized him as a ranger and comrade of Miller and Lash. The fact that the raiders' horses were in the corral meant that they had been grazing during the day. Gorman weighed his options. Had these outlaws come across Miller? It seemed unlikely, as they wouldn't be so comfortable and carefree in camp if they had. Perhaps they were waiting for more members of their gang. That was a possibility. However, Gorman's main concern was getting Blanco Sol to water. His horse needed a drink, no matter the cost. Gorman knew he had to hurry eastward along the trail. He decided to go back to where he had left Blanco Sol and not make any sudden moves until daylight. With the same stealth he had used to approach the campfire, Gorman retreated until he was at a safe distance to rise and walk down the arroyo. He found Blanco Sol grazing contentedly and knew that they had to make their way to the water source as soon as possible. The horse, Blanco Sol, was calm despite the heavy dew falling on the grass. Gorman took refuge behind a small greasewood-covered mound and built a fire and a wash despite the piercingly cold wind. He cooked bacon, made coffee, and ate hard biscuits for his meal. Gorman removed Blanco Sol's halter and let him graze while he sat by the fire to warm himself, replenishing it with greasewood and mesquite. Gorman was wet and cold, hungry and thirsty, and his unhealed wound ached. His beard, unshaven for days, prickled his blistered skin like a million needles. Exhausted, he settled down and did not move. The night was dark, dismal, and windy, with occasional coyote yelps. The silence was stifling and seemed to bury the desert. By conventional standards, John Gorman was a miserable wretch, but the judgment would have missed the vital inner truth. Gorman found solace in the harsh and unforgiving desert. He embraced the privations, pains, perils, and silence that came with the territory. In the past, he had never known hunger, cold, exhaustion, or loneliness. Everything was provided for him, and he had never had to work for anything. Danger and toil were just words on a page. But now he had a purpose. He had a duty to a man who relied on him. He was a valuable ally to the Rangers, and he spent endless days alone with his horse, traversing the hostile terrain. His horse had become human to him, and he had learned to appreciate the simple things in life. The superficialities and falsities that had once consumed him no longer mattered. His happiness was stoic, but he felt love, and it had fostered other traits in him, like a sense of romance and beauty and a keen observation of nature. He felt pain, but he was never miserable. He felt solitude, but he was never lonely. As he rode across the desert, he saw Mona's face in every cloud, and the mesas took on the shape of her profile. There were always reminders of her, whether it was a glint of gold or a touch of red or a graceful line or a gleam of blue. At night her face would appear in the campfire, warm and glowing, flushing and paling. Gorman, always on guard, listened intently to the wind while watching the changing phantom of her sweet face in the embers. The desert was a breeding ground for thought, and Gorman was no exception. The pink and white ashes of his campfire glowed with 1,000 sweet faces, the faces of other sweethearts or wives that had gleamed for other men. But Gorman was content in his thought of Mona. When he was alone in the wilderness, something told him she was near, that she thought of him, that she loved him. Yet there were many men alone on the vast southwestern plateau, and for some their dream faces were fleeting, a mere glimmer of hope and happiness that had been and was now gone. Gorman often thought of the hundreds of desert travelers, prospectors, and wanderers who had ventured down the Camino del Diablo, never to be heard from again. Belding had warned him of that most terrible of all desert trails, a trail of shifting sands. Lash had traversed it and brought back stories of buried waterholes, of bones bleaching white in the sun, of lost gold mines, and the merciless Yaqui and his hatred for the Mexican. The idea of the trail seemed to creep in out of the darkness, the loneliness, and the silence until it found a place in Gorman's mind. It had a strange fascination for him, for many had set up camp for the night, only for it to be their last. It was a realization he had never before comprehended, how men drifted into the desert, leaving behind graves, ruined homes, and lost loves. For every wanderer, each campfire held a phantom face. Gorman could feel the agony of these men in their final moments, while he relished in the promise and joy that lay ahead for him. But he soon remembered his purpose and headed out to find Blanco Sol. The darkness was all-encompassing, making it difficult to see even a foot ahead. But Gorman felt his way through until he rounded a mesquite and saw Sol's white outline against the blackness. The horse was jittery, ready to flee. It seemed unlikely that anyone unknown to Sol could ever catch him. But Gorman's low call reassured him, and he went on grazing. Gorman haltered him in the best patch of grass and made his way back to camp. He placed his saddle in a protected spot under a low wall of the mound and laid one blanket on the sand. The other blanket he covered himself with for the night. The wind's melancholy moan in the mesquite was the only sound he heard. The coyotes had ceased their hungry cries. Gorman drifted off to sleep and slept soundly through the first half of the night, but then he was partially awake, feeling the increasing cold and damp. The dark sky slowly turned gray, and then daylight came quickly. The morning was clear and nippy. Gorman threw off the wet blanket and got up, feeling cramped and half frozen. A little brisk action was all that was necessary to warm his blood and loosen his muscles. Then he felt fresh, tingling, and eager. The sun rose in a golden blaze, and the descending valley took on wondrous changing hues. After saddling Blanco's soul and tying him to a clump of mesquite, Gorman patted the horse's neck and promised him a drink soon. The horse had gone without water for 2 days, and Gorman was determined to quench his thirst before eating. He took his rifle and headed towards the well, where he had seen blue smoke earlier. On his way, he noticed rabbits playing in the willows and walked swiftly until he saw the Mexicans cooking their morning meal. Gorman recognized the small, wiry, swarthy-faced and black-haired raiders who wore Mexican clothes and sombreros. He watched as they leisurely cooked their meal and packed a gun at his hip. Gorman was filled with anger as he observed the trio. They had not yet brought out their carbines and showed no signs of leaving. He then focused his attention on the corral, where he saw over a dozen horses stamping, whistling, fighting, and pawing the dirt. Some of them were fine animals. Using his knowledge of the land and position of trees, Gorman found an easier and safer path towards the well. He was able to get closer to the raiders by being careful. He approached them from above and watched their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. The behavior of the desert horses was completely natural, given that they were penned in and thirsty for water and grass. Suddenly, one of the black horses, a big shaggy fellow, perked up his ears and pointed his nose over the top of the fence. He whinnied, and the other horses followed suit, craning their necks to look in the same direction. Gorman knew that other horses or men, possibly both, were approaching. However, the Mexicans in the area didn't hear the alarm or show any interest if they did. These mezcal-drinking raiders were not scouts and were notoriously easy to surprise or ambush. They were mostly ignorant, thick-skulled peons who were good at riding horses and could go long without food or water. However, they had poor sight, poor hearing, poor judgment, and when excited they resembled crazed ants running wild. Gorman noticed 2 Indians riding up on burros on the other side of the knoll where the adobe house was situated. The Indians didn't seem to be aware of the presence of the Mexicans, so they continued up the path. One of the Indians was a Papago, and the other was a Yaqui, who stood out from the others due to his unusual appearance. They had nothing but a blanket and a half-empty bag for an outfit. They came over the knoll and down the path towards the well, turned a corner of the house, and completely surprised the raiders. Suddenly Gorman heard a short, shrill cry, which was strangely high and wild, and came from one of the Indians. It was quickly followed by hoarse shouts. The leader of the trio, a Mexican who was armed, pulled out his gun and fired point-blank. He missed the first 2 shots, but on the third shot the Papago shrieked and tumbled off his burro to fall in a heap. The second Indian swayed back and forth, clearly weakened after his comrade was taken down by 4 shots. The gunshots frightened the horses in the corral, causing a black horse to break through the rickety bars and rush out. 2 of the Mexicans ran towards the horse, grabbing it by the nose and mane, while the third ran to block the gateway. The Mexican with the gun then made a daring leap onto the back of the horse, yelling and waving his gun while urging the horse forward. The Mexicans on the ground began to dance and jabber while the mounted leader shot again. The horse reared violently, but the Mexican somehow managed to bring it down, nearly trampling the last Indian who had fallen. The horse then plunged down onto the Indian, attempting to avoid striking him with its hooves. The Mexican let out a savage yell, but made no move to trample the Indian's body. Instead, he turned the horse to ride over the other Indian. Gorman was horrified to realize that this was an act of hate towards the Yaqui people, and a reminder of the war of extermination being waged against them. Suddenly, Gorman saw the Yaqui move and weakly raise a hand, shocking him even further. The Mexicans let out angrier and fiercer cries as the action unfolded. The horse, frightened, snorted in terror. Gorman had had enough. He quickly aimed at the rider and fired a shot, missing the figure but hitting the horse. The animal let out a terrible scream, leaped, and then fell to the ground, causing the Mexican to suffer a jarring fall. Both the man and the horse lay motionless. Gorman hurried out of his hiding spot to stop the other raiders from reaching the house and obtaining their weapons. One of the raiders ran in the opposite direction, screaming in panic, while the other remained frozen in place. Gorman approached him and picked up the gun that the leader had dropped. The man began to recover from his stunned state, and the horses, frightened, broke free from the corral, galloping away in a cloud of dust. The fallen raider sat up, muttering prayers and curses. The other Mexican, intimidated by Gorman's threatening rifle, stood his ground. "Go, greasers, run!" Gorman yelled, first in English, then in Spanish. He forced the two raiders to leave the camp at gunpoint. Gorman then ran into the house and grabbed the carbines, breaking them apart with a heavy stone. He then ran to his horse, taking the shortest route down the arroyo, unconcerned about encountering the raiders. If they did meet, it would be to their detriment, and they knew it. Blanco Sol heard Gorman approaching and whinnied a greeting. When Gorman arrived, the horse was ready for battle. He quickly gave Sol a drink and filled his canteens before riding back to the scene of the action. When he arrived at the well, his first thought was to give Sol another drink. After leading his horse out of the waterhole, Gorman decided to take a look at the Indians before mounting again. The Papago was dead, shot through the heart, but the Yaqui was still alive and conscious, staring up at Gorman with black, somber eyes. He spoke in a husky whisper, questioning whether the gringo was good or not for not killing him. Gorman responded that the Yaqui was done for, but the Indian insisted that he wasn't hurt too badly and repeated a strange word over and over. Something in the Indian's voice or face prompted Gorman to reach for his canteen and give the Yaqui a drink. The gratitude in the Indian's eyes was obvious, and Gorman went on to examine his injuries while keeping a wary eye out for danger. The Yaqui had 3 wounds: a bullet hole in his shoulder, a crushed arm, and a badly lacerated leg. Gorman wasn't sure what had happened to the Indian before the raiders attacked, but he knew that the Yaqui would die if left there alone. Despite the danger, Gorman couldn't bring himself to abandon the injured Indian. He quickly bound up the wounds while keeping his rifle close and watching for any sign of trouble. Though he knew he was multiplying his perils 100-fold by taking the Yaqui with him, Gorman couldn't ignore his higher sense of humanity that made it impossible for him to leave the Indian behind. The burros of the Indians and the horses of the raiders had all disappeared from sight. Gorman knew that time was too valuable to waste on a fruitless search. Without hesitation, he hoisted the Yaqui onto the broad shoulders of his trusty steed, Sol, and mounted the saddle. Sol, without protest, began walking swiftly up the trail towards the east. In the distance, Gorman spotted a long line of dust clouds between 2 towering mesas, indicating the location of the horses that had managed to escape the corral. These horses were likely to head straight for home and could possibly lead the others with them. The raiders were left stranded in the desert without their guns or mounts. Blanco Sol was an exceptional horse, capable of walking or trotting at 6 miles per hour without breaking a sweat. Gorman was cautious of expending too much of the horse's energy, as they were still at risk of encountering more raiders or being pursued. Once they were out of sight of Papago Well, Gorman dismounted and walked alongside his horse, keeping a firm hand on the helpless Yaqui. As the sun rose over the eastern horizon, the coolness of the morning dissipated and the desert transformed. The grays turned into bright hues, the mesquites glistened, and the cacti took on a silver, frosty appearance. The rocks shimmered in shades of gold and red. With the increasing heat, a wind picked up from the valley behind Gorman, intensifying with each passing moment. The transparent haze in the distance lost its bluish tint and took on a yellow hue. The flying sand made the peaks appear faintly outlined. Gorman surveyed the vast, smoky landscape, searching for recognizable landmarks. Despite the twinge of pain that shot through his injured hip with each stride, Gorman kept pace with his horse, determined to reach their destination unscathed. As he approached the no-name mountains, their wild and rugged spurs rose up before him, piercing the swirling clouds of sand. It was a sight that made him feel closer to home. Within the hour, he came upon a dark, straight shaft that jutted out from a towering escarpment. This was the monument that marked the international boundary line, and once he passed it, he knew he was back in his own country. When the heat of midday hit, he found some shade beneath a large rock and dismounted, giving the Yaqui a drink before removing Saul's saddle and letting him roll. Gorman took a moment to rest and grab a bite to eat while surveying the vast desert around him. Despite being emaciated from starvation or illness, the Yaqui was still holding on. It was then that Gorman took a closer look at the Indian, studying his features. The Yaqui had a strong, noble face that looked as though it had been chiseled from dark red volcanic lava. His eyes were black and mystic, but they also held a deep sadness that spoke of the desert's tragic desolation. They followed Gorman's every move. As he resumed his journey, he soon found himself facing the Altar Valley, a great depression that was as rough and jagged as if millions of gigantic spikes had been driven into the cracked floor. The valley was a chaotic mix of arroyos, canyons, rocks, and ridges, all of which were covered in prickly cactus. At the eastern end lay the dry bed of Forlorn River, which only flowed when there was water. It was a treacherous and challenging landscape, made even more difficult by the fact that he was carrying a wounded, helpless man across his saddle. But Gorman pressed on, determined to carry the Yaqui as far as he could, even if it meant risking his own life. Blanco Sol trudged forward through the dragging sand, up and down steep, loose banks of washes, over rocks, and through rows of sharp-toothed choyas. The sun began to slope westward, scorching the earth with its fierce heat as if it was reluctant to part. The wind gradually died down and the dust settled. The once forbidding no-name mountains changed their color to red and gold. Gorman held on tight to the saddle of the tireless horse, braving the merciless thorns of the Yaqui. It became a toilsome journey, with his heavy chaps dragging him down, but he dared not take them off. The steel bayoneted spikes of the choyas would sting his legs. Gorman kept a watchful eye on the trail ahead, never letting go of Blanco Sol's gait. As they reached the last mile, the low, flat houses of Forlorn River shone red in the setting sun. Gorman's energy began to wane, and he grew weaker by the second. The Yaqui slumped off the saddle and lay motionless in the sand. Gorman could not mount his horse, so he clutched Saul's tail and stumbled forward. Blanco Sol whistled a piercing blast, sensing cool water and sweet alfalfa hay. Twinkling lights in the distance promised rest. The melancholic desert twilight took over from the sunset, highlighting the forlorn loneliness of the gray, winding river of sand and its even grayer shores. Night shadows began to creep down from the black, looming mountains. Chapter 10. "A disabled Yaqui? Why in the world did you take him under your wing?" Belding bellowed as he carefully laid Gorman down on the bed. Belding had become tough during these recent turbulent weeks. "It was my decision," Gorman murmured in response. "Chase after him, he fell off the path near the first massive saguaro by the river." Belding started cursing as he fumbled with the matches and the lamp. As soon as the flame flickered to life, he halted his profanity mid-sentence. "Are you all right?" John asked, looking down at Gorman with concern. "I'm just exhausted. Could you go get the Yaqui or send someone?" Gorman replied weakly. "Of course, John," Belding responded in a gentler tone before leaving the room. He announced his return to the house and gave a brief explanation of Gorman's condition to the women. "He's not hurt or anything, just tired. Make him comfortable while I take care of something," he instructed before leaving. Gorman's senses dulled as he heard the women's hurried responses. Mrs. Belding appeared at his side, her presence calming and helpful, while Selina and Mona fluttered around him. He drank thirstily but refused food, only wanting rest. As he drifted off into a haze, he felt gentle hands taking care of him. He slept for 20 hours before waking up thirsty, hungry, and sore. He set out to find Belding and continue with their plans. Belding updated Gorman on the Yaqui's condition. "He was close to death, but I think we'll be able to pull him through," he said. Belding then explained the Yaqui's story that he had pieced together. The Mexican government had been trying to eradicate the Yaquis, and a year ago they had taken his tribe to a port on the Gulf. The families were separated and sent to Yucatan to work on the henequen plantations as slaves. They were treated horribly, given only a small piece of sourdough as their daily rations, and were constantly beaten and starved. The Yaquis were bred in a different environment on the high, dry Sonoran Plateau, where the air was sharp like a knife. More and more Yaquis were dropping dead in the henequen fields, and their places were quickly filled by others. The Mexicans had no intention of killing them outright in their war of extermination. No, they needed the Yaquis to work for them. It was a terrible thing to witness. One day, a Yaqui who had escaped from his captors managed to get aboard a ship and eventually made it to New Orleans. He was a sick man when he arrived, and someone gave him a bag of food before he set off with a Papago Indian. However, he must have run into some trouble with some greasers. Gorman shared his story of what happened at Papago Well. "That raider who tried to crush the Yaqui under a horse's hoofs was a hyena," he exclaimed, shuddering at the memory. "I've seen some blood spilled and some hard sights, but that inhuman devil took my nerve. I missed a shot at him not 20 paces. "In cases like that, the sooner you clean up the bunch, the better," replied Belding grimly. "And as for hard sights, wait until you've seen a Yaqui do up a Mexican. Bar none, that is the limit. It's a bloodlust, a racial hate that runs deep and is terrible. The Spaniards crushed the Aztecs 400 or 500 years ago, and that hate has had time to grow as deep as a cactus root. The Yaquis are mountain Aztecs, and personally I think they are noble and intelligent. If left alone, they would be peaceable and industrious. I like the few I've known. But they are a doomed race. Do you have any ideas what ailed this Yaqui before the raider got to him?" "No, I haven't. I noticed the Indian seemed in bad shape, but I couldn't tell what was the matter with him." "Well, my personal opinion is that he was, or is for that matter, dying of a broken heart. All he wanted was to get back to his mountains and die." "There ain't no Yaquis left in that part of Sonora he was heading to," said Gorman, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, I noticed something strange in his eyes, but all them Yaquis look wild. John, if I ain't mistaken, that hombre was a chief. It was a waste of your strength, a needless risk to save him and bring him back here. But damn them greasers in general, I'm glad you did." Gorman then remembered to voice his concern for Miller. "Laddie didn't go out to meet you," replied Belding. "I knew you'd be here any day, and with all the trouble between here and Casita, I sent him that way. Since you've been gone, our friend Carter lost a bunch of horses and a few steers. Did you get a good look at the horses them raiders had at Papago Well?" John had learned, since he became a ranger, to see everything with a sharp photographic eye. And being tested so often, he described the horses as a dark-colored bunch, mostly bays and blacks, with one spotted sorrel. "Some of them horses are Carter's for sure," exclaimed Belding. "His herd got split up and divided among different raider groups. He's got a grass ranch up in 3 Mile Arroyo. It's a good long ride from the border in U.S. territory." "Think them horses I saw will make it back home?" John asked. "Sure, they can't be caught or stopped," replied Belding bluntly. "Well, what do I do now?" asked John. "Stay here and rest," said Belding. "You need it. Let the women fuss over you and give you a little doctoring. When Jim gets back from Sonoita, we'll figure out what we ought to do. By the Lord, seems our job now ain't keeping Japs and Chinks out of the U.S., it's keeping our property from going into Mexico." "Are there any letters for me?" asked Gorman. "Man, have you seen these letters?" exclaimed John, shoving a stack of envelopes across the table to his friend Belding. "My sister Elsie has been writing to me about our hometown of Casita. Apparently things are getting pretty bad there." Belding raised an eyebrow as he sifted through the letters. "It's been a while since anyone's been able to make it out there. The roads are overrun with rebels and raiders. But what's got Elsie so worked up?" John sighed. "Well, she wrote about how our dad is furious with me for supposedly falling into wild and evil ways. I haven't been able to write back to her, but maybe I should try to clear things up with him." Belding nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of trouble, what do you think about George Thorne getting released soon? You remember him, right? The guy who was after Selina before you came along?" John scowled at the mention of Thorne. "Yeah, I remember him, but he's not getting anywhere near Selina if I have anything to say about it." Belding chuckled. "Relax, man. I doubt he could even leave the country at this point. The rebels and raiders have made it impossible to travel anywhere safely. But hey, maybe we can convince him to stick around here in Forlorn River and help us out." John's interest was piqued. "Help us out with what?" Belding leaned in conspiratorially. "I've had dreams of turning this place into a thriving agricultural district ever since you discovered that water supply. With a little help from Thorne, we could really make something of this place." John smiled, envisioning a prosperous future for Forlorn River. "You know what? I think you're right. We just need to wait for this damn war to be over so we can get to work." Belding nodded in agreement. "It's a shame that war has to ruin everything. But hey, at least we have a plan for when it's over." John nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "And speaking of that water supply, have you ever wondered where Forlorn River gets its water from?" As Belding shook his head, John launched into an explanation of the engineering principles behind their discovery, marveling at how his college education had finally paid off in the most unlikely of places. No one, be it a white man, Mexican or Indian, had ever dared to climb the towering no-name mountains to find the source of Forlorn River. But Gorman, a determined man, had discovered a narrow gulch with a rock bottom and walls that could be dammed by dynamiting the leaning cliffs above. This would provide an abundance of water that could be used for mining purposes and to irrigate Alter Valley in the United States. Belding confirmed the presence of gold in the arroyos and gulches, which was not enough to make a prospector jump for joy, but was still worth working for. Moreover, the soil on the higher levels of Alter Valley would grow anything all year round with water. Gorman, too, had dreams for the future of Forlorn River. The following day, Miller appeared unexpectedly, leading a lame and exhausted horse into the yard. Belding and Gorman were surprised beyond words. The horse's legs were raw and red, and it looked like it was about to collapse. Miller was missing his sombrero and had a bloody scarf wrapped around his head. His face was covered in sweat, blood, and dust, and his chaps were full of broken white thorns. "Howdy, boys," he drawled. "I'm sure glad to see you all." "Where the hell is your hat?" demanded Belding angrily. It was a strange question, but Belding's worried expression said more than words ever could. Miller stopped unbuckling the saddle girths and looked at Belding before breaking into his slow, cool laugh. "Tom, do you remember that huge saguaro cactus near Carter's Trail where it branches off the main trail to Casita? I climbed that damn mountain and left my hat on top for a woodpecker's nest," Miller said, catching his breath. "You've been in a fight?" Belding asked, ignoring Miller's comment. "I reckon it'll dawn on you after a while," Miller replied, taking off the saddle. "Laddie, go in the house to the women. I'll tend to your horse." "Sure thing, Tom. Just give me a minute. I've been down the road, and I found horse tracks and steer tracks going across the line. But I didn't see any raiders until this morning. I slept at Carter's last night. That raid the other day cleaned him out. He's shooting mad. Well, this morning I rode right into a group of Carter's horses running wild for home. Some Mexicans were trying to round them up and chase them back across the line. I rode in between and made things difficult for them. Carter's horses got away. Then me and the Mexicans had a little game of hide-and-seek in the cactus. I was on the wrong side and had to break through their line to head back home. We ran some, but I had a closer call than I'm comfortable with." "Laddie, you wouldn't have any close calls if you rode one of my horses," Belding said. "This bronco of yours can run, and Lord knows he's game. But you need a big, strong horse, Mexican-bred with cactus in his blood. Take one of the bunch like Bull, White Woman, or Blanco Jose." "I had a big, fast horse a while back, but I lost him," Miller said. "This bronco isn't so bad. Sure, Bull and that white devil with his Mexican name could run down my horse and kill him in a mile of cactus. But somehow, Tom, I can't make up my mind to take one of those grand white horses. Sure, I reckon I'm kind of soft." Belding cursed under his breath as he contemplated the possibility of the raiders taking his beloved white horses from Forlorn River. Horses ran in his blood. His ancestors had all been passionate about them. His wife and daughter were the only things more precious to him than those horses. "Laddie, can't we get the whites away from the border before it's too late?" he asked his companion. "Maybe it ain't too late, but where can we take them?" Laddie replied. "To San Felipe?" Belding suggested. "No, we've got more chance to hold them here," Laddie argued. "To Casita and the railroad," Belding tried again. "Afraid to risk getting there, and the town's full of rebels who need horses," Laddie pointed out. "Then straight north?" Belding suggested once more. "Sure, man, you're crazy. There's no water, no grass for 100 miles. I'll tell you, Tom, the safest plan would be to take the white bunch south into Sonora, into some wild mountain valley. Keep them there till the raiders have traveled on back east. Pretty soon there won't be any rich pickings left for these greasers. And then they'll ride on to new ranges," Laddie suggested. "Laddie, I don't know the trails into Sonora, and I can't trust a Mexican or a Papago. Between you and me, I'm afraid of this Indian who herds for me," Belding admitted. "I reckon we'd better stick here, Tom. John, it's good to see you again, but you seem kind of quiet. Sure, you get quieter all the time. Did you see any sign of Jim out Sonoyta way?" Belding turned to greet John Miller when he arrived. As Belding led the lame horse towards the watering trough, Miller and John went towards the house. Mona, Belding's daughter, was sitting in the door, and she rose with a little scream and came flying towards them. "Now I'll get it," Miller whispered. "The women'll make a baby of me." "I can't help myself," Laddie muttered under his breath as he pulled a thorn from his ear. Mona, with widened eyes and pale skin, rushed over to him. "Oh, Laddie, you've been hurt!" she exclaimed. Laddie tried to play it off as just a scratch, but Mona wasn't buying it. "Don't lie, Laddie, I know you're hurt. Come inside to Mother," she pleaded. Laddie continued to lie, saying it was just a bronch that threw him off his horse. Mona's accusing eyes only made him feel more guilty. "Maybe I got it when I was riding hard under a mesquite and a sharp snag." He trailed off, but Mona was convinced that Laddie had been shot. She ran to her mother, shouting that Laddie had been shot and that Forlorn River was becoming too dangerous. The once safe and quiet town was now filled with bloodshed, and Mona feared that one day her loved ones would never return home. Despite the turmoil in the town, the morning was still and clear. The heat had not yet risen from the desert, and the colors of the land blended together perfectly. Mona sat atop the corral gate, watching Belding's thoroughbreds graze and play in the alfalfa field. John stood beside her, stealing glances at her face. The field of dark green alfalfa provided a stark contrast to the hot, sandy surroundings. Belding had bred over 100 horses from the original stock he had brought up from Durango, and Mona loved watching them. But her attention was too focused on avoiding John's gaze, making it clear that something was amiss between them. He had a particular interest in the nearly flawless white horses, and he took great care of them. He made a significant amount of money selling this breed to his rancher friends in Texas. However, no amount of money could make him part with the magnificent, towering white horses he had acquired from the Durango breeder. He named them Blanco Diablo, Blanco Sol, Blanca Reina, Blanca Mujer, and El Gran Toro Blanco. Belding had been ridiculed by the cowboys for keeping the sentimental Durango names, but he refused to change them. Blanco Diablo was the only horse in the field that was not allowed to roam freely. He was tethered to a stake and halter in one corner, where he was left alone by the other horses. This isolation did not suit him. The horse was not happy unless he was running or fighting a rival, and he preferred the latter. If a white horse could resemble a devil, Blanco Diablo certainly did. He was not attractive, but he drew the eye and held it. There was something about him that suggested discontent, anger, rebellion, and aggression. When he wasn't grazing or prancing, he held his long, thin head level, pointed his nose, and bared his teeth. Belding's favorite horse was almost his entire world, and he swore that Blanco Diablo could endure more heat, thirst, and cactus than any other horse he owned, and could outrun and defeat any horse in the Southwest. The fact that Miller did not agree with Belding on these crucial points was a great disappointment and a never-ending source of debate. Miller and Lash despised Blanco Diablo, and after narrowly escaping being hit, John Gorman had sided with the cowboys. El Gran Toro Blanco lived up to his name. The stallion before them was a behemoth with thick flanks and a regal presence. He was the perfect match for his glossy mate, Blanca Reina. Another mare, Blanca Mujer, was just as impressive, white as snow and perfectly pointed, with an elegance that belied her strength and brawn. The cowboys could see why Belding favored Diablo, but they remained loyal to Blanco's soul. John tried not to get into arguments over the horse, but he couldn't help feeling a special connection to Sol. Despite his scars and lumps, Sol was a sight to behold. He was longer, bigger, and more powerful than Diablo, and had a wild, proud spirit that reflected the desert around him. "Belding swears Sol never beat Diablo," John remarked. "He believes it," Mona replied. "Dad is obsessed with that horse." "But Laddie rode Sol once and made him beat Diablo. Jim saw the race." Mona laughed. "I saw it too, and I've even beaten Dad's favorite on Sol." "I'd love to see that. Mona, will you ever ride with me?" "Maybe someday when it's safe." "Safe?" John chuckled. "You mean when the raiders have left the border?" "Oh, I'm glad you understand," Mona said, smiling. "I always wonder how Belding ever gave me Blanco Sol," John mused aloud. "He was jealous," Mona replied. "I think he wanted to get rid of Sol." "No? Why, Mona, he'd give Laddie or Jim one of the whites any day." "Would he? Not devil or queen or white woman. Never in this world. But Dad has lots of fast horses the boys could pick from. John, I tell you, Dad wants Blanco Sol to run himself out, lose his speed on the desert. Dad is just jealous for Diablo. Maybe. He surely has a strange passion for horses. I think I understand better than I used to. I owned a couple of racers once. They were just animals to me, I guess. But Blanco Sol. Do you love him? Asked Mona, and John's face lit up with a warm blue flash of his eyes. Do I? Well, rather. I'm glad. Sol has been finer, a better horse since you owned him. He loves you, John. He's always watching for you. See him raise his head? That's for you. I know as much about horses as Dad or Laddie any day. Sol always hated Diablo, and he never had much use for Dad. John looked up at her. It'll be pretty hard to leave Sol when I go away. Mona sat perfectly still. Go away? She asked, with just the faintest tremor in her voice. Yes, sometimes when I get blue as I am today, I think I'll go. But in sober truth, Mona, it's not likely that I'll spend all my life here. There was no answer to this. John put his hand softly over hers, and despite her half-hearted struggle to free it, he held on. Mona! Her color fled. He saw her lips part. Then a heavy step on the gravel interrupted him and made him release Mona and draw back. Belding strode into view around the adobe shed, his cheerful, complaining voice filling the air. Hey, John, that darned Yaqui Indian won't budge no matter what we offer him. I tried giving him a horse, gun, blanket, and food, but he's not interested, said the frustrated speaker. Gorman chuckled. Well, let him stay, maybe put him to work. I don't find it amusing, responded the first speaker. But here's what I think. That poor, homeless, heartbroken Indian has taken a liking to you, John. These desert Yaquis are strange people. I've heard some weird stories about them, and I wouldn't be surprised by anything. That's what I think is going on here. You saved his life, and that's a big deal for any Indian, even an Apache. With a Yaqui, it could hold even more significance. I heard a Yaqui once say that his tribe never left any debt to friend or foe unsettled. Maybe that's what's going on with him. John, please don't laugh, chimed in Mona. I've also noticed the Yaqui. It's sad the way he stares at you with those dark, brooding eyes. You've made a friend, John, added Belding. A Yaqui can be a valuable ally in this desert. If he recovers, he could be of great help to you. But you're responsible for him, and you'll have to keep him from attacking all the Mexicans in Forlorn River. The threat of an attack from raiders prompted Belding to construct a new corral. It wasn't pretty, but it was tall and sturdy. The gate was massive, with large hinges and heavy chains and padlocks. The outside was covered in barbed wire, making it difficult to tamper with in the dark. Belding locked his prized white horses in this corral at night, with a Papago herdsman sleeping in the nearby adobe shed. He knew that no wooden fence could withstand a determined attack from the raiders. Taking their time and making considerable noise, Belding and his crew relied on the fact that a band of night raiders wouldn't hold out against a hot rifle fire. Belding was confident in the plan, but Miller didn't share his optimism. Days passed, and Belding kept his rangers home, not hearing anything about raiders nearby. Many newcomers reported that property and life were cheap in the rebel-infested town of Casita. One January morning, John Gorman was awakened by a shrill cry. He heard Belding's booming voice and rapid steps on the flagstones, but heavy breaths and almost sobs at his door startled him. He saw something white and immediately grabbed his gun. It was Blanco Sol, who normally came around during the day, but now in the early dawn signaled that raiders were near. Gorman called softly to the snorting horse and quickly got dressed, grabbing a gun in each hand. Sol followed him around the house like a scared dog. They heard shouts coming from the direction of the corrals, so Gorman hurried that way, meeting up with Jim Lash, who was also leading a white horse. Gorman remarked that it seemed like everything was over but the fireworks, but Lash wasn't sure what had happened. They arrived at the corral to find Belding, shaking and roaring like a madman. The gate stood wide open and the corral was empty. Miller bent down, scanning the ground for any trace of the missing horses. I reckon we should wait for daylight, Jim suggested. They've flown the coop, that's for sure. Tom, where's the Papago? Miller asked. He's gone, laddie, gone, Tom replied. Double-crossed us, huh? Look here, there's a crowbar by the gatepost. That Indian fetched it from the forge. It was used to pry out the bolts and steeples. Tom, I don't think it took them long to force that gate open, Miller concluded. Belding, in his shirt sleeves and barefooted, roared with anger. He had heard the horses running as he jumped out of bed. What woke you? Laddie asked. Sol. He came whistling for John. Didn't you hear him before I called you? Belding replied. Hear him? He came thundering right under my window. I jumped out of bed, and when he let out that blast, Jim lit up the middle of the floor, and I was scared stiff. John, what did you think when you heard it was your room he blew into? I couldn't think. I'm still shaking, John replied. Boys, I bet Saul spilled a few raiders if any of them got their hands on him, Jim said. Let's wait for daylight. I think we'll find some of the horses running loose. Tom, go get dressed. It's freezing cold, and don't forget to tell the women folks we're okay. As daylight broke, the cowboys discovered the details of the raid. They found tracks of 8 raiders coming up from the riverbed where their horses had been left. Apparently, the Papago had betrayed their trust, and his few personal belongings were missing. Lash was correct in his assessment of finding more horses loose in the fields. The men quickly gathered up 11 horses, all more or less frightened, and among the number were Queen and Blanca Mujer. The raiders were no match for the men on horseback. However, fate had a cruel sense of humor as Belding lost his favorite horse, which was more valuable to him than any other. On the trail, one of the raiders was trying to tame the wild and fierce Blanco Diablo. Jim Lash commented, "We got lucky." Miller retorted, "Lucky ain't enough word. Let me explain. Some of the raiders hopped over the fence while the others worked on the gate. Maybe the Papago went inside to pick out the best horses. But it didn't work out except for Diablo, and how they ever managed to steal him is beyond me. I would have bet that it would have taken at least 8 men to steal him, but those darn greasers are experts at handling horses." Belding was devastated and inconsolable. He cursed and ranted about how he was going to track down the raiders. Miller calmly responded, "Tom, you're not doing anything of the sort." Belding groaned and hung his head in despair. Eventually, he conceded that Miller was right and said, "I have to accept it. I can't leave the women and my property, but it's still tough. I'm angry deep down, and nothing but bloodshed will satisfy me." "Leave it to Jim and me," reassured Miller. Belding was curious and asked, "What do you plan to do?" Miller shrugged and said, "I'm not sure yet. Give me a light for my pipe. And John, go get your yaqui." Chapter 11. The yaqui's eerie gaze scanned the corral, taking in the swinging gate with its broken latch, the tracks in the dusty road, and finally landing on Belding. "Malo," he declared in clear Spanish. Miller piped up, "Yeah, Yaqui's right. There are about 8 unsavory characters and a treacherous Indian lurking around." Belding chimed in, "I think he's talking about my herder." "If that's the case, then we better not take any chances. Yaqui, malo Papago si?" Belding asked. The Yaqui spread his arms wide in response before bending down to examine the tracks in the dirt. As they searched for the raiders, they went in all directions, but eventually they found the trail that the cowboys had taken down to the river. Belding and the rangers followed closely behind, while John helped the still weak Indian. They stumbled upon an area where the raiders had left their horses, and from there they saw a narrow trail that led across the dry riverbed. Belding asked the Yaqui where the raiders were likely headed in the Sonora Desert. The Indian led them across the stream of sand, through willows and mesquite, up to the rocky level where he paused. They saw a sand-filled trail that led off to the left and seemed to go around the east of No Name Mountains. Meanwhile, the right side of the road led towards Papago Well and the Sonoita Oasis. The trail of the raiders went southeast over an unexplored desert. The Yaqui spoke in his native tongue before switching to Spanish. Belding interpreted, "I think he means the raiders are moving slowly. From their trail it seems that they are having trouble with the horses." Laddie replied, "Tom, anyone can see that. Ask Yaqui to tell us where the raiders are heading and if there's water." The Yaqui drew a map in the sand to explain. He pointed with his dark hand at a low white escarpment in the distance. Then with a stick he traced a line in the sand before placing crosses, marks, and holes. As he drew he spoke in Yaqui, Spanish, and broken English. Belding did his best to translate. The raiders were moving southeast towards the railroad that ran from Nogales down into Sonora. It was a 4-day journey on a bad trail with a good waterhole one day out. However, water was not guaranteed for the next 2 days. A band of raiders were on the move, taking their time and not looking for trouble. However, they were in danger of being ambushed at the first waterhole, which was a natural trap in a valley. The men eventually made their way back to the ranch, where the rangers quickly made preparations for travel. The cowboys made sure their horses were fed, watered, and saddled, while Miller refused to ride one of Belding's horses and demanded a long-range rifle and plenty of shells. Despite Belding's protests, Miller insisted on having a gun that could outshoot the rebels. In less than an hour, the 3 heavily armed rangers rode out on the trail, superbly mounted on fresh horses. As they rode out, Gorman turned to look back and saw Mona waving a white scarf. He waved his sombrero before the mesquites hid Mona's figure, and they rode on. Miller led in single file, taking shortcuts and making a beeline for the white escarpment pointed out by the Yaqui. The raiders were traveling leisurely and avoiding cactus-covered stretches of ground, but Miller stuck to his course, only swerving when faced with deep washes and impassable patches of cactus or rocks. Keeping the bronco at a steady pace, Miller and Gorman traveled over the rough terrain. The sun beat down on them as the wind picked up, sending clouds of dust rolling across the horizon. Whirling columns of sand circled up, resembling waterspouts at sea before being swept away by the wind. The rocky escarpment rose before them, changing color and showing breaks upon its face. Before descending, Miller required a long, careful, sweeping survey of the desert ahead through the field glass. Streams of white and yellow dust, along with clouds of sand over glistening dunes, could be seen, but no sign of moving horses. At noon, the rangers escaped the thick cactus, and the terrain gave way to hard sandy rolls and bare clay knolls. The desert resembled a rounded sea of color dominated by shades of blue, pink, yellow, and mauve, all under the glaring sun. Mirages glistened and faded in the shimmering waves of heat. Fine dust whiffed up from under the hooves as they rode on towards the looming escarpment. Gorman spotted the raiders and horses as they reached the slope of the escarpment. In another hour of travel, the rangers could see a long, moving streak of black and white dots heading towards a yellow pass in the eastern end of the escarpment. "They're heading for that yellow pass," said Miller, pointing it out. "When they get out of sight, we'll be ready to move." "I reckon that waterhole the Yaqui was talking about is in this pass," Miller declared. The rangers rode quickly across the remaining miles of flat desert leading to the ascent of the escarpment. As they reached the entrance of the pass, the sun was setting in the west. Small mesquite and greasewood plants were scattered among the rocks. Miller ordered the men to dismount and proceed on foot. The narrow pass opened up into a valley that was half a mile wide and possibly twice as long. The slopes leading up to the high walls were rocky, weathered, and impossible to climb. The valley floor was bare, white, and hard, except for a small patch of green mesquite at the other end. It was a dismal and bleak spot, the bottom of a desert basin. "Stay low, boys," Miller cautioned. "The waterhole is over there, and horses have sharp eyes. The Yaqui must have known about this place. I've never seen anything like it before. It's a trap for sure." Both the white and black horses were visible against the greenery, and a thin trail of blue smoke was rising lazily from the mesquite grove. "I think we should wait until it's dark, or maybe even till daylight," Jim Lash suggested. "Let me take a look at the outlet to this hole, John. It looks rough to me." Gorman examined the narrow walls and the rough terrain. "It's harder to get out from the other end than from here, lad," he replied. "And it's already hard enough to get out from here. Let me take a closer look." "Well, boys, this job doesn't require much thinking. Jim, I'll need you to block the other end of the pass when we're ready to move." "When will that be?" Jim asked. "As soon as it's light enough in the morning," Miller replied. "The Mexican gang will have to wait till tomorrow. There won't be any reliable water for 2 more days, remember?" "I think I can sneak through to the other end after dark," Lash mused. "It might get me in trouble to go around," muttered one of the rangers. They had retreated from their lookout and returned to their horses, which they had left further around the cliffs. The horses were thirsty and hungry, but the rangers managed to build a fire and have a quick yet nourishing meal. The campsite was high up, and they could see the vast desert stretching out endlessly to the west through a break in the rocks. As the sun set, the mountains' golden tips dulled and their shadows crept upwards. One of the rangers, Jim Lash, rolled up in his saddle blanket and fell asleep near the fire. Miller instructed Gorman to do the same while he kept the fire going and waited until it was late enough for Jim to sneak around the raiders undetected. When Gorman woke up, the night had turned cold and windy, with stars shining brightly. Jim was already up, saddling his horse, while Miller spoke in low tones. The other ranger, Gorman, wanted to accompany them, even though Miller and Jim said he need not go. However, Gorman insisted because he knew that was what Miller or Jim would have done. Miller led the way, and they moved slowly and cautiously into the darkness. The black walls around them seemed impenetrable, but the horse was as careful as his rider. Miller navigated between blocks of stone and mesquite, often trying a path only to abandon it. Eventually the trail appeared faintly in the darkness, and the eastern stars twinkled between the towering walls of the pass. The trio continued to move stealthily, slow and steady. Finally, when the dense gloom of the pass gave way to a wide expanse of sky and stars overhead, Miller halted and stood still for a moment. "Luck is on our side again," he whispered. "The wind is blowing in your face, Jim. The horses won't smell you. Move slowly, don't make a sound." "Stick close to the wall," Miller said, his calm voice belying the danger that lay ahead. "Try to climb up as high as possible on the other end. Wait until daylight before attempting any loose slope. I'll be heading out early, that's all." Lash obediently led his horse away, moving slowly to avoid making any noise. As his horse's soft hooves disappeared into the shadows, Miller turned to John and touched his arm. Together they made their way back to the campfire, picking their way carefully through the winding cliffs. The fire had died down, but Miller quickly replenished it before lying down to get some sleep. Gorman kept watch, pacing back and forth, listening for any signs of danger. The night wore on, the stars paling and the darkness growing thicker. The air grew colder, and Blanco Sol occasionally stamped his hooves, the only sound in the stillness. Before the faintest hint of gray appeared in the sky, Miller awoke. The rangers ate and drank, then saddled their horses and made their way to the pass where they had parted with Lash. They waited there, watching the gray shadow below thin out and the patch of mesquite in the valley below slowly come into view as the day dawned. Gorman grew restless, his impatience aggravating the slow fire within him, but Miller remained silent and grim as the time for action approached. They waited until the daylight was strong enough, then finally set off on their perilous journey. Gorman pondered what the plan of attack would be, but he refrained from asking. He stood at the ready, awaiting orders. The valley cleared of the shadowy gray hue, except for areas under the leaning walls on the eastern side. Suddenly, a straight column of smoke emerged from the mesquites. This was evidently what Miller had been anticipating.